Welcome to the lands of science fiction stories. I wish you a pleasant listening experience.
The forest was silent under the star-strewn sky, with only the faint whispers of night creatures moving through the underbrush. Lucan Viros, a former power plant engineer, leaned back on his porch, lost in the familiar solitude of his mountain retreat. He'd come here to escape the chaos of the world, drawn to the mountain's quiet allure. His cabin, miles away from the nearest town, was surrounded by tall stoic pines, their branches swaying in rhythm with the cool mountain breeze. Lucan took a long sip of his coffee, savoring its warmth against the chill of the night. He'd spent years on adrenaline-pumping high-stakes emergency jobs, but here, under the quiet watch of the mountains, he'd found peace, until tonight. Out of nowhere, a brilliant flash ripped across the sky, turning night to day. He squinted as the light flared, searing his vision, and before he could fully comprehend, it vanished, leaving a faint afterglow behind his eyelids. The flash left him stunned, frozen in place as he watched the phenomenon unfold. Then, in the wake of the light, a fireball streaked across the heavens, trailing smoke and flames. His trained instincts kicked in. He'd seen crashes before, but this was different. Whatever it was plummeted through the atmosphere, crossing over the mountain range and crashing somewhere in the dense woods beyond, an earth-shaking impact that sent a deep rumble through the ground beneath him. Lucan's heart raced. He bolted to his feet, rushing into his cabin to grab a flashlight, an emergency kit, and a sturdy coat. His mind raced as he prepared. Whatever had just fallen, it was close, and it was his job to help if he could. Within minutes, he was making his way through the forest, guided by the dull orange glow now illuminating the horizon. His flashlight cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the trees as he picked his way through the underbrush. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of burning metal, mixed with an unfamiliar, almost electric scent. He'd seen plenty of machinery go up in flames during his time as an engineer, but this was different, sharper foreign. The source of the crash came into view, and Lucan stopped dead in his tracks. Nestled in the middle of a small clearing was the mangled wreckage of a craft, its sleek silver hull unlike any design he'd ever seen. This wasn't a downed plane or a stray meteorite. It was otherworldly. The hull gleamed under the moonlight, its shape too smooth, too polished, with peculiar markings etched along the remaining intact surfaces. Pulsing lights blinked erratically across the fragments, casting ghostly, colorful shadows across the surrounding forest floor. Lucan took a step closer, feeling the pull of something beyond curiosity, a sense of duty, maybe even destiny. He had to know who, or what, had come down with this ship. Moving carefully through the debris, he heard it, a faint, labored gasp. He stopped, straining his ears. The sound was close, muffled by layers of twisted metal. Following the noise, he lifted his flashlight, his breath catching as he saw a slender, almost ethereal figure half buried beneath a sheet of debris. The figure was unmistakably female, her form delicate, but there was something unearthly about her. He reached out, pushing aside the sheet of twisted metal with careful precision, revealing more of the figure beneath. Her skin was a soft iridescent blue, shimmering faintly as if lit from within. Lucan's heart pounded in his chest as he gazed at her, his eyes tracing the subtle differences in her features. She was humanoid, but her high cheekbones, elongated limbs, and otherworldly aura made her undeniably alien. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, and he could see dark blood, an unnatural shade of violet, seeping from a gash along her side. His instincts as an emergency responder took over. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm here to help." The alien girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open, revealing a pair of deep violet irises that locked onto his face. They were filled with an intense vulnerability, a mixture of fear, confusion, and something else, perhaps hope. She tried to speak, her lips parting as a weak melodic sound escaped, but she was too weak to form words. Lucan pressed a reassuring hand against her shoulder. "Don't talk," he said gently, "I'm going to get you out of here." He glanced around, considering his options. Getting her back to the cabin was going to be a challenge. She was light but appeared fragile, almost as if she could break with a careless touch. With infinite care, he slipped his arms beneath her, lifting her off the ground. Her head rested against his shoulder, and he felt her shiver, her skin cool against his own. The journey back was grueling. The forest was treacherous at night, and he moved with deliberate caution, watching every step to avoid jostling her. He could feel her uneven breaths against his neck, each shallow rise and fall a reminder of her vulnerability. It was almost dawn when he finally reached his cabin, his muscles aching as he carried her over the threshold and laid her down on his bed. Lucan quickly set to work, pulling out supplies from his medical kit. He knelt beside her, examining the wound along her side. The strange, violet blood continued to seep from it, and he frowned, unsure if his usual methods would work on an alien physiology. But he pushed his doubts aside. He had to try. He cleaned the wound as best he could, applying gentle pressure to stem the bleeding. All the while, her eyes followed him, never wavering, filled with a gratitude that was palpable despite the pain. "Just hold on," he murmured, his fingers deftly applying a bandage. "You're going to be okay." As he worked, he couldn't shake the surreal nature of it all. Here he was, treating a creature from another world as if she were any other person. And yet, in the moments when their eyes met, it felt almost ordinary. She had a presence that seemed to bridge the gap between their worlds, a silent strength that made him feel protective. Once her wounds were tended, Lucan stepped back, exhaling a sigh of relief. Exhaustion swept over him, but he stayed by her side, unwilling to leave her alone. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the cabin window, he sat on the edge of the bed, studying her features. Despite the differences, her blue skin, her violet eyes, there was a strange familiarity in her expression, a gentleness that mirrored his own. "What am I going to call you?" he mused aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. The name came to him in a soft, unexpected thought. "Taryn," he murmured. "I'll call you Taryn." As dawn broke, casting a warm golden glow over the cabin, he watched her slip into a deeper sleep, her breaths becoming more even. His own eyes grew heavy, but he forced himself to stay awake, guarding her as she rested. In the morning light, the strangeness of the situation felt more real, but also somehow right. She was a mystery, a being from another world who had crash-landed into his life. And yet, in this quiet moment, he felt a profound sense of connection, as though they were both part of something much larger than he could yet understand. With one last look at Taryn, he allowed himself a brief moment of rest, knowing that this was just the beginning. The next few days passed in a surreal blur for Lucan. Each day, he awoke to find Taryn slowly gaining strength, her wounds healing at a pace that defied his understanding of biology. The violet blood on her bandages faded to a deep lavender as the wounds closed, and her breathing grew stronger. Despite the limitations of his first aid kit, she seemed to possess an innate resilience that went beyond anything he'd encountered before. Lucan began to form a routine around her care. Every morning, he would bring her a glass of water and, using gestures and careful motions, encourage her to drink. Her movements were cautious and curious. She seemed both perplexed by and intrigued with the simple act of drinking water. Sometimes, he would catch her looking at the glass as though it were a marvel of engineering, examining every inch of it as if it held secrets of his world. As the days turned into a week, Taryn's movements became more fluid and steady. One afternoon, he found her awake and watching him intently. She gestured toward him, her delicate fingers weaving an unfamiliar pattern in the air, and pointed at the glass, then back at herself. Lucan took the hint, nodding with a soft smile, and poured her a fresh glass of water. "You're learning fast," he murmured, as though she could understand. And yet, in those violet eyes, he sensed a keen intelligence, one that didn't need words to communicate. Her curiosity about his surroundings grew with her strength. When she felt well enough to sit up in bed, she would gesture toward objects in the room, a book, a lamp, his workbench covered in tools, and Lucan would carefully pronounce the names for her. At first, her voice was weak, but gradually, she began to mimic his words, her accent a melodic undertone that brought life to even the simplest phrases. "Lamp," he would say, pointing to the lamp beside the bed. Taryn would look at it, her eyes narrowing in focus before she softly echoed, "Lumpy." Her voice was a lilting, otherworldly sound that seemed to add a grace to even the most mundane words. One afternoon, while golden sunlight filtered through the cabin's small windows, Taryn attempted to rise from the bed for the first time. Lucan was by her side in an instant, reaching out to steady her, his hands instinctively finding her shoulders. She looked up at him, surprise flickering across her face, but she allowed his hands to support her. The closeness between them was undeniable, a silent connection that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. "Careful," he murmured, his voice softer than he intended. Taryn held his gaze for a moment, her violet eyes unreadable, yet filled with something unspoken. She raised a hand, placing it over his where it rested on her shoulder, and Lucan felt a spark, a strange warmth that ran from her skin into his, as if they shared a pulse. It was only for a heartbeat, but it left him breathless. After a few steadying breaths, She moved to the edge of the bed, determined to stand. Lucan released her shoulders slowly, his hands hovering nearby, ready to catch her if she faltered. With an almost childlike concentration, she steadied herself on her feet, her hands reaching out to feel the solidity of the floor beneath her. The sense of accomplishment in her expression was unmistakable. She looked at him with a mixture of pride and gratitude, and Lucan couldn't help but grin. "You're doing great, Taryn." Her lips curved into a faint smile, a gesture that looked both foreign and entirely natural on her face. She attempted a few small steps, her body moving with a cautious elegance, as if she were rediscovering the world around her. Lucan stayed close, guiding her when needed, his presence both comforting and reassuring. They moved slowly through the cabin, Taryn pointing to objects she found intriguing. When she came across his workbench, cluttered with tools and gadgets from his engineering days, her eyes lit up with intense curiosity. She reached for a screwdriver, holding it up and examining it from every angle. Lucan explained its use as best he could, using gestures to demonstrate how it fit into the heads of screws. She mimicked his motions, clearly fascinated by the mechanics, and even managed a small nod of understanding. As the days wore on, her questions, mostly expressed through gestures, grew bolder. She would trace shapes in the air, sometimes tapping her chest and pointing to the sky, her eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and yearning. Lucan watched her, his heart aching with the realization that she wanted to tell him more, to explain the circumstances that had brought her here. But every time she tried, her words came out as unintelligible syllables, a mix of melodic clicks and trills. One evening, they sat outside the cabin, a shared silence between them as they watched the stars emerge one by one. Taryn looked up at the sky, her gaze distant and sad. She tapped her chest, then pointed to the brightest star visible in the inky night sky, as if to say, "That's where I came from." Lucan followed her gesture, feeling the weight of her longing. "You miss it, don't you?" he asked softly, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. She nodded, her expression softening, and then, in a tentative motion, she placed her hand on his shoulder. The gesture was subtle, but it spoke volumes. She trusted him, needed him in a way that went beyond language. Slowly, the bond between them grew into something that felt almost like friendship, yet it was deeper, more intimate. Despite the lack of spoken words, they communicated through looks and small gestures, each conveying an understanding that felt as natural as breathing. One night, after she had returned to bed, Lucan was about to leave her side when she reached for his hand. Her touch was gentle, yet her grip was surprisingly firm, holding him there as if she didn't want to be alone. He sat back down, his heart pounding as he realized she was looking at him with a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. Her eyes held his, and for the first time she spoke, a single word in her own language, soft and filled with a sorrowful yearning. He didn't understand the word, but he felt its weight, its significance. It was as if she were sharing a part of herself, revealing a pain she could no longer keep hidden. Without thinking, Lucan brushed a stray strand of her silver-blue hair away from her face, his fingers lingering on her cool skin. Her eyes fluttered shut at his touch, and in that quiet, charged moment, he felt an unspoken promise pass between them, a vow of protection, of solidarity. They were two beings from different worlds, yet in that moment, they understood each other perfectly. In the following days, Lucan couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had shifted between them. Every time he looked at her, he felt an ache, a pull that went beyond the bounds of logic or reason. He didn't know if it was attraction, compassion, or something else entirely, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. One afternoon, as he helped her take tentative steps outside, she stumbled slightly, and he instinctively reached out, catching her in his arms. She looked up at him, her face inches from his, and for a heartbeat, the world around them seemed to disappear. The warmth in her gaze was unmistakable, and in that fleeting instant, Lucan felt the boundaries between them blur, as if they were two souls connected across the vast chasm of the unknown. Taryn reached up, placing a hand on his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heartbeat beneath her palm. Her touch lingered, her violet eyes filled with an unspoken question, a vulnerability that struck him to his core. Lucan swallowed, his heart pounding as he gazed down at her, captivated by the trust in her gaze, the silent plea for understanding. Without a word, she leaned closer, her hand trailing up his chest to rest lightly against his neck. Lucan felt his pulse quicken, his senses heightened by her nearness, the faint scent of something sweet and alien lingering in the air between them. She tilted her head slightly, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. Slowly, deliberately, Lucan closed the distance, his lips brushing softly against hers in a tentative kiss. Her lips were cool and soft, and she responded with a shy urgency, as if she'd been waiting for this moment as much as he had. They lingered, suspended in a shared breath, before they both drew back, eyes meeting in a mixture of wonder and quiet understanding. For a moment, they simply stood there, lost in each other's gaze, both fully aware that whatever had just happened was far more than a mere kiss. It was a bridge, a silent affirmation that their connection transcended the boundaries of language, culture, and even species. As they pulled apart, Lucan felt a warmth settle in his chest, a certainty that he would protect her, no matter the cost. And in her gaze, he saw the same resolve, a mutual promise that, despite the odds, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead together. They were two beings from distant worlds, bound by an unspoken bond that grew stronger with every passing day. And as the night settled around them, Lucan knew deep down that he would do anything to keep her safe. The days that followed were filled with a sense of tentative peace, yet Lucan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that it wouldn't last. Taryn's condition had improved rapidly, and her curiosity about his world grew bolder with each passing day. She spent her mornings exploring the cabin, her hands tracing over every object as though each held a secret she could unlock. Lucan watched her with a sense of wonder, answering her silent questions as best as he could, but he knew she was waiting for more, a way to reach her people, a way home. One evening, they stood outside, watching the last embers of daylight fade over the mountains. Lucan leaned against the railing of the porch, looking up at the sky with Taryn at his side. She tapped his arm, gesturing with a sweep of her hand as if to encompass the stars above them. Her eyes were distant, filled with longing and a flicker of something else, urgency perhaps. She tapped her chest, then pointed back toward the sky, her gaze pleading. "I know, Taryn," Lucan murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You want to go home. We'll figure something out. I promise." As if to reassure her, he placed his hand over hers, feeling the cool, smooth texture of her skin. For a moment, they stood in silence, her fingers curling around his. Lucan's heart hammered in his chest, a strange mixture of protectiveness and something deeper, a pull he couldn't quite put into words. But as the night deepened, an unsettling presence gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. His instincts, honed from years of dealing with emergencies, sensed something amiss. Lucan's gaze drifted into the surrounding forest, his mind alert to the slightest sound. The peace was shattered by a faint rustle in the underbrush, followed by the snap of a twig. Lucan's body went rigid, his hand instinctively tightening around Taryn's. She sensed his tension immediately, her body stiffening as her gaze followed his, scanning the darkness. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. He stepped away, slipping inside the cabin to retrieve his old hunting rifle. He hadn't had to use it in years, but tonight, the weight of the weapon in his hands felt strangely comforting. As he returned to the porch, Lucan's eyes scanned the tree line, the shadows seeming to shift and stir. The forest was silent, almost unnaturally so, and he felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced back at Taryn, motioning for her to stay close. The next sound came without warning. A window on the far side of the cabin shattered with a sharp, deafening crash. Lucan swung around, his finger instinctively moving to the trigger as his heart pounded in his chest. Smoke began to fill the cabin, an acrid, thick cloud that stung his eyes and seared his lungs. Taryn covered her mouth, her wide violet eyes filled with fear as she stumbled back. "Run, Taryn!" Lucan shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the back door. He knew the terrain well enough. If they could make it to the ravine nearby, they might lose their attackers in the dense undergrowth. But as they reached the back door, a dark figure stepped into view, blocking their path. The intruder was humanoid, but unmistakably alien. Its skin was a mottled gray, its eyes glowing an eerie green through a sleek high-tech breathing apparatus. In one hand, it held a strange cylindrical device, pulsing with a faint blue light that seemed to hum in sync with his own heartbeat. Lucan didst hesitate. With a shout, he raised the rifle and fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the quiet night, and the alien staggered back, a dark fluid seeping from its side. But it recovered quickly, its gaze locking onto Lucan with a deadly focus. Taryn pulled at his arm, her face pale and frantic, but before they could move, two more figures emerged from the shadows, closing in on them. Lucan gritted his teeth, positioning himself between Taryn and the attackers. "We're not leaving here without a fight," he muttered, determination stealing his voice. He fired another shot, but the intruders seemed prepared, dodging and advancing with a practiced agility that made his stomach twist. In that moment, Taryn stepped forward, her body radiating an intensity he hadn't seen before. Her hands began to glow with a soft, ethereal light, her fingers tracing intricate patterns in the air as if drawing on some unseen energy. The air around them seemed to ripple, distorting with a strange power that sent a tingling sensation along Lucan's skin. A guttural cry filled the air as the nearest attacker clutched its head, staggering backward as if struck by an invisible force. Taryn's face was a mask of concentration, her eyes narrowed and fierce as she unleashed a wave of energy that sent the remaining aliens reeling. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Lucan's gaze darted from the attackers, now retreating into the shadows, back to Taryn, whose shoulders slumped in exhaustion. Her breathing was shallow, her skin losing its glow as she struggled to stay upright. Lucan rushed to her side, steadying her as she swayed on her feet. "Taryn, are you okay?" he whispered, his heart pounding as he took in the sight of her pale face, her strength clearly spent. She managed a weak nod, her violet eyes meeting his with a mix of apology and determination. But before he could ask more, another sound cut through the air, a low mechanical hum, growing louder by the second. Lucan's heart sank as he realized what it was. The attackers hadn't retreated, they had called for reinforcements. From the shadows, more figures emerged, their eyes glowing with the same eerie green light, weapons in hand as they closed in. "We need to get out of here," Lucan said, his voice barely concealing the fear thrumming through him. He grabbed Taryn's hand, leading her through the broken window and into the forest, their breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps as they ran. The forest was dark and disorienting, the trees casting twisted shadows that seemed to reach out toward them. Lucan's every step was calculated, his mind racing to map out a path to the ravine. But the sounds of pursuit were close, their attackers crashing through the undergrowth with relentless precision. They finally reached the ravine, the steep, rocky slope offering a temporary barrier against their pursuers. Lucan helped Taryn down, his hand steadying her as she struggled to keep her balance. They pressed themselves against the rocks, their breathing heavy as they listened to the footsteps drawing nearer. Taryn's gaze flickered to him, her eyes wide and desperate. She made a quick series of gestures, pointing to herself and then back in the direction of the cabin. Lucan understood immediately. She wanted him to leave, to save himself while she confronted their attackers. "No," he whispered fiercely, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "We're in this together. I'm not leaving you." Her eyes softened, a trace of gratitude flashing across her face before she turned her focus back to the path above them. The footsteps paused, their attackers seemingly scanning the area. Lucan held his breath, his body tense as he waited for the slightest hint of movement. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps receded, leaving only the sound of their ragged breathing. Lucan slumped against the rock, his heart racing with relief, but he knew they weren't safe yet. The attackers were persistent, and it was only a matter of time before they found them again. Taryn reached for his hand, squeezing it in a silent thank you. Lucan looked down at her, his own fear momentarily eclipsed by the fierce protectiveness he felt. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle as he whispered, "We'll find a way out of this. I promise." She nodded, leaning into his touch for just a moment, a gesture of trust that sent a surge of warmth through him. They stayed that way, hand in hand, as the night stretched on, both knowing that their bond was now more than a silent promise. It was their only hope of survival. In the early hours of the morning, they made their way back toward the cabin, careful to avoid any remaining pursuers. The cabin was in shambles, windows shattered, smoke lingering in the air. Lucan's heart sank at the sight of his once peaceful home, now nothing more than a battlefield. But as he looked at Taryn, her face a mixture of determination and exhaustion, he knew they had to press on. "We can't stay here," he said softly. "They'll be back, and we can't keep running like this." Taryn nodded, her gaze steady as she gestured toward the road leading down the mountain. It was clear she had no intention of giving up, and neither did he. Lucan gathered what supplies he could, packing food, water, and a few essential tools into a weathered backpack. As they prepared to leave, he caught Taryn's gaze one last time, the silent bond between them stronger than ever. They were no longer just two strangers from different worlds. They were allies, bound by a shared struggle. Hand in hand, they left the cabin, stepping into the unknown together, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The future was uncertain, but Lucan knew one thing for sure: he would do whatever it took to protect her, even if it meant facing the darkest corners of the universe. Lucan and Taryn spent the better part of the day on foot, following narrow trails that twisted through the dense forest and occasionally veered into the rocky terrain of the mountains. The attack on the cabin had left Lucan on edge, every rustling leaf and snapping twig sharpening his senses as they made their way to the only place he thought could offer them any safety, the isolated farmhouse of his oldest friends, Roller and Elise Calver. The Calvers had lived on their secluded property for years, cut off from the nearest town by miles of rugged wilderness. It wasn't just isolation that made him trust them. They were kind-hearted people with enough history between them that Lucan knew he could rely on them now, more than ever. They reached the farmhouse just after nightfall. The lights were dim, the old wooden structure nestled under the canopy of trees, half hidden in the shadows. Lucan approached cautiously, his arm wrapped protectively around Taryn. Despite the exhaustion on her face, she held herself with a quiet resilience, her violet eyes scanning the dark surroundings as if ready for another attack. The front door creaked open, and Roller stepped out, his face etched with lines of worry as he squinted into the darkness. Lucan raised a hand in greeting, and Roller's eyes widened with recognition. He hurried down the steps, his voice filled with relief. "Lucan. By God, we were worried sick." Elise heard about some kind of disturbance in the area. His gaze shifted to Taryn, his expression becoming a mixture of confusion and concern as he took in her unusual appearance. "And who's this?" "It's a long story, Roller," Lucan said, exhaustion clear in his voice. "But we're in trouble. I need your help." Roller nodded, his face grave as he beckoned them inside. Elise appeared in the doorway, her eyes filled with a gentle curiosity as she studied Taryn. Despite her alien features, Elise didn't flinch or question her presence. She simply offered a warm smile, as if welcoming a stranger into her home was the most natural thing in the world. "Come on in, dear," Elise said softly, reaching out to guide Taryn inside. "You look like you could use a warm meal." Lucan watched as Taryn hesitated for a moment, glancing back at him with uncertainty. He nodded, reassuring her, and she allowed Elise to lead her into the cozy farmhouse. The warmth of the place seemed to melt some of the tension in her shoulders, and as they settled around the table, Elise served bowls of steaming soup, her hands gentle and steady despite the questions lingering in her eyes. As they ate, Lucan explained everything to Roller and Elise: the crash, the attackers, and the terrifying display of power Taryn had unleashed to protect them. His friends listened in stunned silence, their gazes darting to Taryn, who sat quietly, her attention focused on her bowl, though it was clear she understood much of what was being said. When Lucan finished, Roller let out a low whistle, his brow furrowed with worry. "Aliens, government types, energy blasts. Lucan, this sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. But I believe you." He looked at Taryn, his expression softening with empathy. "And I believe you too, Mississippi." Taryn met his gaze, her violet eyes reflecting a depth of gratitude that needed no words. She placed a hand over her heart, bowing her head in a gesture that seemed both humble and regal. Elise reached across the table, resting her hand over Taryn's with a gentle smile. "You're safe here, dear," Elise said softly. "We'll do whatever we can to help you." After they had finished eating, Roller motioned for Lucan to follow him into his small workshop, a room cluttered with electronic equipment and bits of salvaged metal. A retired communications specialist, Roller had a penchant for tinkering, and his workshop was filled with everything from old ham radios to makeshift transmitters. He settled into a well-worn chair, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the table. "You think her people are still looking for her?" Roller asked, his tone serious. Lucan nodded. "If the attackers found us once, they'll find us again. Taryn tried to tell me she's part of something important, something political, maybe even dangerous. I think they're here to take her back, or worse." Roller scratched his chin, his gaze thoughtful. "I can try boosting one of my old transmitters. If her people are searching, they might pick up a signal. It's a long shot, but it's better than nothing." They spent the next few hours rigging up a makeshift communication device, a mix of salvaged parts and jury-rigged circuits. Lucan wasn't sure if it would work, but seeing Roller work with a quiet determination filled him with a sliver of hope. Taryn joined them, her curiosity piqued as she watched them wire the contraption together. She asked questions through gestures and occasional soft murmurs, her fascination with human technology evident in every motion. Roller showed her how to operate the dials, his patience unwavering as he explained each step. Taryn proved to be a quick study, her fingers moving with a delicate precision as she adjusted the frequency. The device crackled to life, static filling the room, and for hours, they scanned through endless noise, hoping for a signal. Late into the night, when fatigue was starting to weigh heavily on them all, a faint rhythmic pattern broke. Through the static. Taryn's eyes widened, her hands flying over the controls as she adjusted the frequency with a grace that left Lucan in awe. Her face was a mask of concentration as she leaned forward, her voice rising in a series of melodic clicks and trills that sounded both urgent and desperate. The response came swiftly. Though Lucan couldn't understand the words, he felt the emotion behind them, a mixture of relief, urgency, and something darker, a warning that sent a chill through him. Taryn's expression shifted as she listened, a flicker of fear passing over her face before she turned to Lucan, her gaze filled with both hope and dread. "They're coming for her," Lucan said quietly, his own voice tinged with worry. "But it sounds like it's not just her people. Others are searching too." Roller nodded, his face grim. "If that's the case, we need to prepare." The next day was a blur of activity as they prepared the farmhouse for the possibility of another attack. Lucan and Roller fortified the doors and windows, using scrap metal and wooden boards to create makeshift barricades. Elise, calm and composed, prepared provisions, filling bags with food, medical supplies, and water. Taryn worked alongside them, her focus unwavering, as though the very act of preparing was a form of courage. That evening, as they gathered in the main room, Elise handed each of them a steaming mug of tea. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the unspoken knowledge that they might not all make it through the night unscathed. "Whatever happens," Elise said softly, her gaze sweeping over each of them, "we're in this together." Lucan reached for Taryn's hand, feeling her fingers entwine with his in a silent promise. Her violet eyes met his, and in that moment, he felt an overwhelming urge to protect her, to stand by her no matter the cost. The stillness of the night was broken by the faint sound of approaching vehicles. Lucan's heart pounded as he moved to the window, peering through the curtains. 3 black SUVs were making their way up the drive, headlights piercing the darkness like ominous beacons. "They're here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Roller exchanged a look with Elise, a silent understanding passing between them. Without hesitation, they moved to the front of the house, positioning themselves to buy Lucan and Taryn as much time as possible. Elise pressed a gentle hand to Lucan's shoulder, her gaze filled with a motherly resolve. "Take her to the old storm cellar out back," she murmured. "We'll do our best to keep them busy." Lucan nodded, a knot forming in his throat. He squeezed her hand, a silent thank you, before turning to Taryn. He grabbed her hand, leading her toward the back door, his heart racing as the sounds of footsteps and shouted orders grew closer. They slipped into the darkness, moving swiftly through the field to the storm cellar, hidden under a thicket of bushes. Lucan wrenched the rusted doors open, guiding Taryn down the steps and into the cramped, musty space below. He closed the doors behind them, plunging them into near-total darkness. In the silence, he could hear his own heartbeat pounding, each beat a reminder of the danger closing in around them. Taryn's hand found his in the darkness, her grip tight and steady, and he took a deep, calming breath. "We'll make it through this," he whispered, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed his fear. They sat in silence, the minutes stretching into hours, punctuated only by the muffled sounds of movement above them. Occasionally, they heard shouts, the distant crack of gunfire, and the eerie hum of unfamiliar technology. But they stayed hidden, their breaths quiet, their bodies tense as they waited. As dawn's light began to seep through the small cracks in the cellar doors, Taryn suddenly stiffened beside him. She raised her head, as though listening to a sound only she could hear her. The world outside the storm cellar was eerily still, the morning light casting long shadows across the dew-covered grass. Lucan's heart raced in his chest, a pounding reminder of the danger that lingered just beyond their hiding place. He gripped Taryn's hand tightly, the connection between them stronger than ever, as they emerged into the open. She squeezed his hand in return, her eyes wide but determined, reflecting a mix of fear and resolve. "Are you sure?" Lucan whispered, his voice barely audible. Taryn nodded, her gaze never leaving the horizon, where the distant sound of engines hummed faintly. The attackers were close, too close. And if they were going to survive, they had to act fast. Without another word, Lucan led her through the overgrown field, their footsteps muffled by the thick grass. The farmhouse, now a looming shadow in the distance, seemed distant and unreachable. But they couldn't go back there, not with the SUVs parked at the front and the unmistakable sound of voices approaching. Taryn moved with purpose, her movements fluid and graceful despite her exhaustion. Lucan could see the faint glow returning to her skin as she drew on some unseen energy, preparing for whatever lay ahead. He didn't fully understand her power, but he trusted it. More than that, he trusted her. They reached the edge of the field and ducked into the trees, moving silently through the dense woods. Lucan's breath was shallow as he kept his ears tuned to the sounds around them, every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf, threatening to give them away. His mind raced, considering their next steps, but Taryn remained calm, her eyes scanning the forest as if she could sense something just beyond his reach. "Taryn," Lucan said softly, breaking the silence. "We can't keep running forever. We need a plan. If you can." She raised a hand to stop him, and he immediately fell silent. Her eyes flicked to the sky, and Lucan followed her gaze, squinting as a large shadow passed overhead. It was a ship, no, a vessel of some kind. Larger than any aircraft he had seen. The gleaming surface reflected the sunlight as it hovered above the treeline, casting an eerie light over the forest floor. "It's them," Taryn murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't need to say more, Lucan understood. Her people were here. But so were their enemies. Before he could react, the ground beneath them trembled slightly, a low hum reverberating through the air. The ship descended slowly, its engines thrumming with a low power, and the surrounding trees seemed to bend slightly under the weight of its presence. Taryn stepped forward, her posture straightening, as if she was preparing for an encounter far beyond the scope of their escape. "We have to face them, Lucan," she said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "I can't run anymore." Lucan's heart sank, but he knew there was no other choice. They couldn't hide forever. "All right," he replied, his voice steady despite the chaos rising inside him. "Let's go." They made their way toward the clearing where the ship had touched down, Lucan moving as cautiously as he could, keeping an eye on the approaching danger. The vessel's landing was nearly complete, and the metallic whine of the engines faded into an eerie silence. Then, the hatch opened. Out stepped several figures, humanoid but unmistakably alien. Their bodies were sleek, clad in shimmering armor that reflected the light in a way that almost made them appear ethereal. Their faces were obscured by visors, their eyes glowing faintly with a strange, unnerving light. They were tall, imposing, and their movements were methodical, as if they had been trained for this moment. Taryn moved forward without hesitation, and Lucan followed, his hand still clutching hers. The two of them approached the alien group, Lucan's pulse hammering in his ears. He knew these were Taryn's people, her allies, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. There was no warmth in their arrival, only a chilling sense of urgency. "Stop," one of the figures commanded, their voice amplified through a translation device. "You have no right to be here." Lucan's grip on Taryn's hand tightened. "What do you want with her?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. The figure's gaze flicked to Taryn. "She belongs with us," the alien said coldly, "for the sake of our world. She has already failed to protect her people once." Taryn's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing with a flash of something fierce and untamed. "I didn't fail," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I chose to fight for what is right, not for power. And I will not return to a world that cannot even protect its own." The air between them crackled with tension. Lucan could feel the heat rising in the clearing, and the words from Taryn's mouth only seemed to deepen the divide between her and the alien figures before them. The alien who had spoken stepped closer to Taryn, his voice growing colder. "Your actions have made you an enemy to your own people. You should not have interfered. The conflict will escalate now, and your place is no longer here." Taryn stepped back slightly, her body instinctively drawing closer to Lucan, as though seeking his protection. Lucan's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to show fear. He had to stand strong for her. "She's not going back with you," Lucan said firmly, his voice unwavering. "And neither am I. We will protect each other." The alien leader's eyes flicked to Lucan, his gaze icy. "You're too late, human. The war has already begun. Your lives are of no consequence." Lucan's heart clenched as he realized what they were facing. These weren't just political opponents. They were part of something far more dangerous, an empire or faction that was willing to do anything to ensure control. And now they wanted Taryn back, not as an ally, but as a prisoner. Taryn stepped forward, her eyes glowing faintly with the same light they had shown when she had protected Lucan in the cabin. The power that radiated from her was unmistakable, a force that seemed to bend the air around them. The aliens hesitated, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch. "I will not go back," she said again, her voice resolute. You can either leave, or you can face me. The alien leader took a step back, his posture shifting as he realized the gravity of her words. The energy around them grew thick with tension, the battle for Terran's freedom hanging in the balance. Lucan stood beside her, his heart racing, but his resolve unshaken. The leader finally raised a hand, signaling the rest of the aliens to stand down. For a brief moment, Lucan thought they would be forced to fight. But then, the leader spoke again, his voice heavy with resignation. Very well. We will leave, for now. But know this, there is no escape from what you've set in motion, Terran. The war will come, whether you're ready or not. Terran's eyes flashed, and with one final glance at Lucan, she nodded. Let them come. I'll fight for the future, and I'll fight for you. The aliens turned and retreated into the ship, the hatch closing behind them with a hiss. The vessel slowly lifted off, rising into the sky and disappearing into the distance. Lucan and Terran stood there in the quiet aftermath, the weight of the moment settling in. The battle was far from over, but for now, they had won. Together. Are you okay? Lucan asked, his voice soft as he reached for her hand. Terran turned to him, her violet eyes filled with something deeper now, gratitude, but also a new sense of resolve. I will be, as long as you're with me. And in that moment, Lucan knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The future was uncertain, but the bond between them was unbreakable.